In this video, we are going to discuss everything about weak squares you must know in order to play chess. What is a weak square in chess, and not only that, but 5 ways to create weak squares in your opponent's camp, and also what to do when you have weak squares in your possession. This video is going to be very interesting if you really want to improve your game, so make sure to watch till the end. So without any further ado, let's jump into the video. So first of all, what is a weak square in chess? A weak square in chess is a square that can't be controlled by the pawn. So for example, in this particular position, we are having a knight on d5 and black pawns are on c5, d6 and e5. And you see there is no pawn on c6 or e6 that can attack the knight in this position. So that is why d5 square is a weak square for black, because this square cannot be controlled by the pawns because pawns are already held. So this is an example of a weak square in chess. Let me show you another example. Okay, discussing this particular example in this position, e5 bishop or e5 square is a weak square for black because you see like there is no pawn on d6 or f6 that can control the e5 square. So that is why e5 square is a weak square, and that is why white has placed his bishop over there, because e5 square is simply the weak square for black. So this is an example of weak square. So I guess you guys have already understood what the idea of the weak squares. What is a weak square? So now let me take you to the 5 steps of how to create weak squares in your opponent's camp. So let's jump into it. Step number 1, destroy the structure. So in this particular position, you see it's white to play, and white played the move bishop to g5. What is the idea? White's idea is to simply capture the knight, because then black would be forced to capture the knight with the pawn. And if you try to move the knight, the rook is hanging on d8. And the fact here is black cannot really protect the knight with any of its pieces. So in this position, for example, if black tries to play h6, we can already capture the knight, and you see now f5 square is a weak square. Why? Because the pawn cannot control the square, because there is no pawn on g6 or e6. So now white can simply put the knight to f5, get his queen, and white is already completely winning. So going back, so in the game black played the move d5, sacrificing a pawn, but white simply took the pawn, and now you see white is simply a pawn up, though the queen is now defending the knight. But now white is simply materially up, and you can already understand that this position is already better for white. So this was the first position, destroy the structure. So now let's move on to the second step. Second step, weaken the structure. So in this position, you see there is no particular weak square for black because every square is kind of covered by the pawn. So we need to create weak squares. How can we do so? By pushing up the pawn. White played the move g5. And here black is having two options, either to push the pawn or either to take the pawn, because or else white is simply going to capture this pawn. So it doesn't matter. In the game black pushed the pawn, but now you see when black pushed the pawn to f5, now the e5 square is a very weak square because it cannot be protected by the f6 or d6 square. So here first white even played the move a5, realizing that the c5 square can also become a weak square. Once again black is having two options, to either capture the pawn or to push the pawn. Black pushed the pawn, but now white simply put the knight on c5, because now there are two weak squares in the position, which is c5 and e5. White played knight to c5, kicking the bishop, but now simply e4, takes, king goes back, and now you see because of like many weaknesses in this position, many weak squares in this position, white simply able to get inside the black's camp, and now white is completely winning. So this was the second step, weaken the structure. So now let's move on to the third step. Step number 3, provocation. What is the provocation? Basically, you kind of force your opponent to make a move. For example, in this position, white played the move queen to e4. What is the idea? White is threatening black to checkmate in one move. So black kind of have to play the move g6 in order to stop the mate on h7. So here we kind of provoked black to push the pawn to g6, and now you will realize that dark squares are extremely weak. Why? Especially the f6 and the h6 squares are extremely weak because these squares cannot be protected by the pawns, because there are no pawns on g7 or e7. So here white simply took the advantage of putting the bishop on h6 and also playing the move queen h4. What is the idea? The idea is to take control of another weak square, which is f6, and now simply threatening to checkmate the black king. So this is how easily you can identify any weak squares in the position. So this was the step number 3, provocation. So now let's move on to the step number 4. Step number 4, push a pawn to create weakness. So in this particular position, white played the move d4, because after d4 you will realize now black cannot really push the pawn because we can simply take the pawn, and that's why now the e5 square is a very weak square for black. Black played the move rook to e8 with the idea of pushing up the pawn, but now white simply put the knight on f3, knowing that not allowing black to push the pawn, and now the idea is just simply put his knight on e5, and eventually e5 square is very weak because this square cannot be protected by any of the pawns. So that is why white is already very much better. Simply put the knight on e5 and white is pretty happy. So this was the 4th step, push the pawn to fix the weakness. So now let's move on to the 5th step. 5th step, sacrifice. So in this particular position, it's kind of even material wise, but white played a very strong move in this position, which is rook into f6. You see what is the idea? In this particular position, white wants to put the knight on f5, but he can't do so because black can simply push the pawn to g6, attacking the knight. So that is why white first decided to sacrifice the rook for the knight. It's basically 5 versus 3. So now white is 2 pawns down, technically speaking up. But now you will realize that the f5 square is a completely weak square for the black, because black is not really having any pawns on g6 or e6 to attack the knight. So this is why f5 square is literally a very good move positionally. So the best way to continue the position is to first play queen h5, put the queen to h6, attacking this pawn, rook g8 takes, and now simply knight to f5, and now black is also going to lose material, and also the f5 square is a very weak square. So basically another idea generally in weak squares here is to even sacrifice material to put your pieces at the best squares, like what white played in the game, knight to f5, and white is completely winning in this position. So this was the 5th step, sacrifice. So now let's try to discuss how to deal with the positions whenever you are having the weak squares in your possession. Step number 1, get rid of them. So in this particular position, you will realize that white is having a very weak square on e4, because our no pawn can really control the e4 square. So here it's white to play, and white plays the move knight to c3, attacking this pawn on d5. So first black has to protect this pawn, and now white simply pushes the pawn to e4, get rid of the weakness. That's easy, yeah? e4, and now you will realize that now there are no particular weaknesses, because there was a weakness on e4, but you simply removed it by trading off your pawns, and now there is no particular weakness in the white's position, and white is pretty happy. So this was the first step, get rid of your weakness. So now let's move on to the step number 2. Step number 2, defend your weaknesses. So in this position, you will realize that it's white to play, and white's having a very weak square on d4, because there is no pawn on c3 or e3 to protect the d4 square. So black's idea is pretty simple. He wants to put his knight to d4. So in this position, white played the move knight to b3, also like attacking the bishop, and also most importantly protecting the d4 square. That's the whole idea, defend your weakness. Black played the move knight to d4, white simply traded on d4, and now bishop e3 takes, and now you will realize that now white is not really having any weakness on d4, because black is not having the material to put his pieces on the d4 square, and now white is extremely fine with a completely equal position. So this was the second step, like basically try to defend your weaknesses. So now let's move on to the 3rd step. Step number 3, make the weakness useless. For example, in this position, it's a black to play. Black puts the pawn to g4, and in this position, white played the move knight to h4. And now you will realize that definitely h4 square is a weak square, because black is not really having any pawn on g5 to attack the knight on h4. But you will realize that the knight is on h4, and definitely the h4 square is a weak square, but there is no point of putting the knight on h4 because there is nothing happening on h4. Like, where can this knight even go? I don't know. Like, the knight can go to g6, but nothing is happening once again. So that is why just like looking for the squares which are useless, though they are weak, it doesn't make any sense. So try to put the pieces on that square whenever, like, which is the best square, like which kind of helps us to take control of the position. Like currently h4 square is kind of a useless square, so it doesn't really make a difference if white is even able to put his pieces over there or not. At the place of knight h4, you will realize that the c4 square is also weak because black is also not really having any pawn on d5 or b5. So playing the move knight to d2 is much better, with the idea of putting the knight to c4, which can be very useful because it controls more squares in the position. So it can make a very critical decision in the endgame. So that's why c4 square is much better compared to h4. So that's why you need to understand this idea that even if you allow your opponent to sometimes to, like, you basically make a weak square, but though if that weak square is weak and it doesn't really make, it basically doesn't really help your opponent to get control of it. So yeah, you can actually allow your opponent to get that square. So this was the third step, basically useless weak square. So I hope that we have covered everything. What is a weak square? 5 ways to create weaknesses in your position, in your opponent's position. And third, how to get rid of weaknesses whenever you are having weaknesses in your position. So I hope that this video was instructive and it helped you to improve your game and learn something new. If it did, then make sure to like and subscribe. I'm going to come up with these more educational chess content. If you want a chess video on any particular topic, make sure to tell me in the comment box below and I'm going to come up with that particular video on. So I'm going to see you soon, so till then stay tuned and keep watching Oneshot Chess, and bye bye.